This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Book 6. After Courses. 1. The Inevitable Moment Onward. The story of the deaths of Eustacia and Wild Eve was told throughout Egdon and far beyond for many weeks and months. All the known incidents of their love were enlarged, distorted, touched up, and modified till the original reality bore but a slight resemblance to the counterfeit presentation by surrounding tongues. Yet, upon the whole, neither the man nor the woman lost dignity by sudden death. Misfortune had struck them gracefully, cutting off their erratic histories with a catastrophic dash, instead of, as with many, attenuating each life to an uninteresting meagreness, through long years of wrinkles, neglect, and decay. On those most nearly concerned the effect was somewhat different. Strangers who had heard of many such cases now merely heard of one more. But immediately where a blow falls, no previous imaginings amount to appreciable preparation for it. The very suddenness of her bereavement dulled, to some extent, Thomason's feelings, yet irrationally enough. A consciousness that the husband she had lost ought to have been better did not lessen her mourning at all. On the contrary, this fact seemed at first to set off the dead husband in his young wife's eyes, and to be the necessary cloud to the rainbow. But the horrors of the unknown had passed. Vague misgivings about her future as a deserted wife were at an end. The worst had once been matter of trembling conjecture. It was now matter of reason only, a limited badness. Her chief interest, the little Eustacia, still remained. There was humility in her grief, no defiance in her attitude, and when this is the case, a shaken spirit is apt to be stilled. Could Thomason's mournfulness now, and Eustacia's serenity during life, have been reduced to common measure, they would have touched the same mark nearly. But Thomason's former brightness made shadow of which in a sombre atmosphere was light itself. The spring came and calmed her. The summer came and soothed her. The autumn arrived, and she began to be comforted, for her little girl was strong and happy, growing in size and knowledge every day. Outward events flattered Thomason not a little. Wild Eve had died intestate, and she and the child were his only relatives. When administration had been granted, all the debts paid, and the residue of her husband's uncle's property had come into her hands, it was found that the sum waiting to be invested for her own and the child's benefit was little less than £10,000. Where should she live? The obvious place was Bloom's End. The old rooms, it is true, were not much higher than the between-decks of a frigate, necessitating a sinking in the floor under the new clock-case she brought from the inn, and the removal of the handsome brass knobs on its head, before there was height for it to stand. But, such as the rooms were, there were plenty of them, and the place was endeared to her by every early recollection. Clym very gladly admitted her as a tenant, confining his own existence to 2 rooms at the top of the back staircase, where he lived on quietly, shut off from Thomason and the 3 servants she had thought fit to indulge in now that she was a mistress of money, going his own ways and thinking his own thoughts. His sorrows had made some change in his outward appearance, and yet the alteration was chiefly within. It might have been said that he had a wrinkled mind. He had no enemies, and he could get nobody to reproach him, which was why he so bitterly reproached himself. He did sometimes think he had been ill used by fortune, so far as to say that to be born is a palpable dilemma, and that instead of men aiming to advance in life with glory, they should calculate how to retreat out of it without shame. But that he and his had been sarcastically and pitilessly handled in having such irons thrust to their souls, he did not maintain long. It is usually so, except with the sternest of men. Human beings, in their generous endeavour to construct a hypothesis that shall not degrade a first cause, have always hesitated to conceive a dominant power of lower moral quality than their own, and, even while they sit down and weep by the waters of Babylon, invent excuses for the oppression which prompts their tears. Thus, though words of solace were vainly uttered in his presence, he found relief in a direction of his own choosing when left to himself. For a man of his habits, the house and the £120 a year which he had inherited from his mother were enough to supply all worldly needs. Resources do not depend upon gross amounts, but upon the proportion of spendings to takings. He frequently walked the heath alone, when the past seized upon him with its shadowy hand, and held him there to listen to its tale. His imagination would then people the spot with its ancient inhabitants. Forgotten Celtic tribes trod their tracks about him, and he could almost live among them, look in their faces, and see them standing beside the barrows which swelled around, untouched and perfect as at the time of their erection. Those of the dyed barbarians who had chosen the cultivable tracts were, in comparison with those who had left their marks here, as writers on paper besides writers on parchment. Their records had perished long ago by the plough, while the works of these remained. Yet they all had lived and died unconscious of the different fates awaiting their relics. It reminded him that unforeseen factors operate in the evolution of immortality. Winter again came round, with its winds, frosts, tame robins, and sparkling starlight. The year previous, Thomasin had hardly been conscious of the season's advance. This year she laid her heart open to external influences of every kind. The life of this sweet cousin, her baby, and her servants came to Klim's senses only in the form of sounds through a wood partition as he sat over books of exceptionally large type, but his ear became at last so accustomed to these slight noises from the other part of the house that he almost could witness the scenes they signified. A faint beat of half-seconds conjured up Thomasin rocking the cradle. A wavering hum meant that she was singing the baby to sleep. A crunching of sand, as between millstones, raised the picture of Humphrey's, Fairway's, or Sam's heavy feet crossing the stone floor of the kitchen. A light boyish step, and a gay tune in a high key, betokened a visit from Grandfer Cantle. A sudden break-off in the grandfer's utterances implied the application to his lips of a mug of small beer. A bustling and slamming of doors meant starting to go to market. For Thomasin, in spite of her added scope of gentility, led a ludicrously narrow life, to the end that she might save every possible pound for her little daughter. One summer day Klim was in the garden, immediately outside the parlour window, which was as usual open. He was looking at the pot flowers on the sill. They had been revived and restored by Thomasin to the state in which his mother had left them. He heard a slight scream from Thomasin, who was sitting inside the room. "Oh, you frightened me," she said to someone who had entered. "I thought you were the ghost of yourself." Klim was curious enough to advance a little further and look in at the window. To his astonishment, there stood within the room Diggory Venn, no longer a Redelman, but exhibiting the strangely altered hues of an ordinary Christian countenance: white shirt-front, light flowered waistcoat, blue-spotted neckerchief, and bottle-green coat. Nothing in this appearance was at all singular but the fact of its great difference from what he had formerly been. Red, and all approach to red, was carefully excluded from every article of clothes upon him. For what is there that persons just out of harness dread so much as reminders of the trade which has enriched them? Yeobright went round to the door and entered. "I was so alarmed," said Thomason, smiling from one to the other. "I couldn't believe that he had got white of his own accord. It seemed supernatural." "I gave up dealing in Reddel last Christmas," said Venn. "It was a profitable trade, and I found that by that time I had made enough to take the dairy of 50 cows that my father had in his lifetime. I always thought of getting to that place again if I changed at all, and now I am there." "How did you manage to become white, Diggory?" Thomason asked. "I turned so by degrees, ma'am." "You look much better than ever you did before." Venn appeared confused, and Thomason, seeing how inadvertently she had spoken to a man who might possibly have tender feelings for her still, blushed a little. Clym saw nothing of this, and added good-humouredly, "What shall we have to frighten Thomason's baby with, now you have become a human being again?" "Sit down, Diggory," said Thomason, "and stay to tea." Venn moved as if he would retire to the kitchen, when Thomason said with pleasant pertness as she went on with some sewing, "Of course you must sit down here. And where does your 50-cow dairy lie, Mr. Venn?" "At Stickleford, about 2 miles to the right of Alderworth, ma'am, where the meads begin. I have thought that if Mr. Yeobright would like to pay me a visit sometimes, he shouldn't stay away for want of asking. I'll not bide to tea this afternoon, thank ye, for I've got something on hand that must be settled. 'Tis Maypole Day tomorrow, and the Shadwater folk have clubbed with a few of your neighbours here to have a pole just outside your palings in the heath, as it is a nice green place." Venn waved his elbow towards the patch in front of the house. "I have been talking to Fairway about it," he continued, "and I said to him that before we put up the pole it would be as well to ask Mrs. Wildeve." "I can say nothing against it," she answered. "Our property does not reach an inch further than the white palings." "But you might not like to see a lot of folk going crazy round a stick under your very nose?" "I shall have no objection at all." Venn soon after went away, and in the evening Yeobright strolled as far as Fairway's cottage. It was a lovely May sunset, and the birch trees which grew on this margin of the vast Egdon wilderness had put on their new leaves, delicate as butterflies' wings, and diaphanous as amber. Beside Fairway's dwelling was an open space recessed from the road, and here were now collected all the young people from within a radius of a couple of miles. The pole lay with one end supported on a trestle, and women were engaged in wreathing it from top downwards with wildflowers. The instincts of Merry England lingered on here with exceptional vitality, and the symbolic customs which tradition has attached to each season of the year were yet a reality on Egdon. Indeed, the impulses of all such outlandish hamlets are pagan still. In these spots homage to nature, self-adoration, frantic gaieties, fragments of Teutonic rites to divinities whose names are forgotten, seem in some way or other to have survived medieval doctrine. Yeobright did not interrupt the preparations, and went home again. The next morning, when Thomason withdrew the curtains of her bedroom window, there stood the maypole in the middle of the green, its top cutting into the sky. It had sprung up in the night, or rather early morning, like Jack's beanstalk. She opened the casement to get a better view of the garlands and posies that adorned it. The sweet perfume of the flowers had already spread into the surrounding air, which, being free from every taint, conducted to her lips a full measure of the fragrance received from the spire of blossom in its midst. At the top of the pole were crossed hoops decked with small flowers, Beneath these came a milk-white zone of Maybloom, then a zone of bluebells, then of cowslips, then of lilacs, then of ragged robins, daffodils, and so on, till the lowest stage was reached. Thomasin noticed all these, and was delighted that the May revel was to be so near. When afternoon came, people began to gather on the green, and Yeobright was interested enough to look out upon them from the open window of his room. Soon after this, Thomasin walked out from the door immediately below, and turned her eyes up to her cousin's face. She was dressed more gaily than Yeobright had ever seen her dressed since the time of Wild Eve's death, 18 months before. Since the day of her marriage, even, she had not exhibited herself to such advantage. "How pretty you look today, Thomasin," he said. "Is it because of the maypole?" "Not altogether." And then she blushed and dropped her eyes, which he did not specially observe, though her manner seemed to him to be rather peculiar, considering that she was only addressing himself. Could it be possible that she had put on her summer clothes to please him? He recalled her conduct towards him throughout the last few weeks, when they had often been working together in the garden, just as they had formerly done when they were boy and girl under his mother's eye. What if her interest in him were not so entirely that of a relative as it had formerly been? To Yeobright any possibility of this sort was a serious matter, and he almost felt troubled at the thought of it. Every pulse of lover-like feeling which had not been stilled during Eustatia's lifetime had gone into the grave with her. His passion for her had occurred too far on in his manhood to leave fuel enough on hand for another fire of that sort, as may happen with more boyish loves. Even supposing him capable of loving again, that love would be a plant of slow and laboured growth, and in the end only small and sickly, like an autumn-hatched bird. He was so distressed by this new complexity that when the enthusiastic brass band arrived and struck up, which it did about 5 o'clock, with apparently wind enough among its members to blow down his house, he withdrew from his rooms by the back door, went down the garden, through the gate in the hedge, and away out of sight. He could not bear to remain in the presence of enjoyment to-day, though he had tried hard. Nothing was seen of him for 4 hours. When he came back by the same path, it was dusk, and the dews were coating every green thing. The boisterous music had ceased, but entering the premises as he did from behind, he could not see if the May party had all gone till he had passed through Thomasin's division of the house to the front door. Thomasin was standing within the porch alone. She looked at him reproachfully. "You went away just when it began, Clem," she said. "Yes, I felt I could not join in. You went out with them, of course?" "No, I did not." "You appeared to be dressed on purpose." "Yes, but I could not go out alone. So many people were there. One is there now." Yeobright strained his eyes across the dark green patch beyond the paling, and near the black form of the maypole he discerned a shadowy figure, sauntering idly up and down. "Who is it?" he said. "Mr. Venn," said Thomasin. "You might have asked him to come in, I think, Tamsy. He has been very kind to you, first and last." "I will now," she said, and acting on the impulse, went through the wicket to where Venn stood under the maypole. "It is Mr. Venn, I think?" she inquired. Venn started as if he had not seen her, artful man that he was, and said, "Yes." "Will you come in?" "I am afraid that I have seen you dancing this evening, and you had the very best of the girls for your partners. Is it that you won't come in because you wish to stand here and think over the past few hours of enjoyment?" "Well, that's partly it," said Mr. Venn with ostentatious sentiment. But the main reason why I am biding here, like this, is that I want to wait till the moon rises." "To see how pretty the maypole looks in the moonlight?" "No, to look for a glove that was dropped by one of the maidens." Thomason was speechless with surprise. That a man who had to walk some 4 or 5 miles to his home should wait here for such a reason pointed to only one conclusion: the man must be amazingly interested in that glove's owner. "Were you dancing with her, Diggory?" she asked, in a voice which revealed that he had made himself considerably more interesting to her by this disclosure. "No," he sighed. "And you will not come in, then?" "Not tonight, thank you, ma'am." "Shall I lend you a lantern to look for the young person's glove, Mr. Venn?" "Oh, no, it is not necessary, Mrs. Wildeve, thank you. The moon will rise in a few minutes." Thomason went back to the porch. "Is he coming in?" said Clem, who had been waiting where she had left him. "He would rather not tonight," she said, and then passed by him into the house, whereupon Clem too retired to his own rooms. When Clem was gone, Thomason crept upstairs in the dark, and, just listening by the cot to assure herself that the child was asleep, she went to the window, gently lifted the corner of the white curtain, and looked out. Venn was still there. She watched the growth of the faint radiance appearing in the sky by the eastern hill, till presently the edge of the moon burst upwards and flooded the valley with light. Diggory's form was now distinct on the green. He was moving about in a bowed attitude, evidently scanning the grass for the precious missing article, walking in zigzags right and left, till he should have passed over every foot of the ground. "How very ridiculous," Thomason murmured to herself, in a tone which was intended to be satirical. "To think that a man should be so silly as to go mooning about like that for a girl's glove! A respectable dairyman, too, and a man of money as he is now. What a pity!" At last Venn appeared to find it, whereupon he stood up and raised it to his lips. Then placing it in his breast-pocket, the nearest receptacle to a man's heart permitted by modern raiment, he ascended the valley in a mathematically direct line towards his distant home in the meadows. End of Book 6. 1. Recorded by Gesine in Valletta, May 2006.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Book 6. Aftercourses. 2. Thomason walks in a green place by the Roman road. Clem saw little of Thomasin for several days after this, and when they met, she was more silent than usual. At length he asked her what she was thinking of so intently. "I'm thoroughly perplexed," she said candidly. "I cannot for my life think who it is that Diggory Venn is so much in love with. None of the girls at the Maypole were good enough for him, and yet she must have been there." Clem tried to imagine Venn's choice for a moment, but ceasing to be interested in the question, he went on again with his gardening. No clearing up of the mystery was granted her for some time, but one afternoon Thomasin was upstairs getting ready for a walk, when she had occasion to come to the landing and call, "Rachel!" Rachel was a girl about 13 who carried the baby out for airings, and she came upstairs at the call. "Have you seen one of my last new gloves about the house, Rachel?" inquired Thomasin. "It's the fellow to this one." Rachel did not reply. "Why don't you answer?" said her mistress. "I think it's lost, ma'am." "Lost? Who lost it? I've never worn them but once." Rachel appeared as one dreadfully troubled, and at last began to cry. "Please, ma'am, on the day of the Maypole I had none to wear, and I seed yours on the table, and I thought I would borrow 'em. I didn't mean to hurt 'em at all, but one of 'em got lost. Somebody gave me some money to buy another pair for you, but I've not been able to go anywhere to get 'em." "Who's somebody?" "Mr. Van." "Did he know it was my glove?" "Yes, I told him." Thomasin was so surprised by the explanation that she quite forgot to lecture the girl, who glided silently away. Thomasin did not move further than to turn her eyes upon the grass plot where the Maypole had stood. She remained thinking, then said to herself that she would not go out that afternoon, but would work hard at the baby's unfinished, lovely plaid frock, cut on the cross in the newest fashion. How she managed to work hard, and yet do no more than she had done at the end of 2 hours, would have been a mystery to anyone not aware that the recent incident was of a kind likely to divert her industry from a manual to a mental channel. Next day she went her ways, as usual, and continued her custom of walking in the heath with no other companion than little Eustacia, now of the age when it's a matter of doubt with such characters whether they are intended to walk through the world on their hands or on their feet, so that they get into painful complications by trying both. It was very pleasant to Thomasin, when she had carried the child to some lonely place, to give her a little private practice on the green turf and shepherd's thyme, which formed a soft mat to fall headlong upon when equilibrium was lost. Once, when engaged in this system of training, and stooping to remove bits of stick, fern stalks, and other such fragments from the child's path, that the journey might not be brought to an untimely end by some insuperable barrier 1/4 of an inch high, she was alarmed by discovering that a man on horseback was almost close beside her, the soft natural carpet having muffled the horse's tread. The rider, who was Ven, waved his hat in the air and bowed gallantly. "Diggory, give me my glove," said Thomasin, whose manner it was, under any circumstances, to plunge into the midst of a subject which engrossed her. Ven immediately dismounted, put his hand in his breast pocket, and handed the glove. "Thank you. It was very good of you to take care of it." "It is very good of you to say so." "Oh, no, I was quite glad to find you had it. Everybody gets so indifferent that I was surprised to know you thought of me." "If you'd remembered what I was once, you wouldn't have been surprised." "Ah, no," she said quickly, "but men of your character are mostly so independent." "What is my character?" he asked. "I don't exactly know," said Thomasin simply, "except it is to cover up your feelings under a practical manner, and only to show them when you are alone." "Ah, how do you know that?" said Ven strategically. "Because," said she, stopping to put the little girl, who had managed to get herself upside down, right end up again, "because I do." "You mustn't judge by folks in general," said Ven. "Still, I don't know much what feelings are nowadays. I've got so mixed up with business of one sort and t'other that my soft sentiments are gone off in vapour like. Yes, I'm given up body and soul to the making of money. Money is all my dream." "Oh, Diggory, how wicked!" said Thomasin reproachfully, and looking at him in exact balance between taking his words seriously and judging them as said to tease her. "Yes, 'tis rather a rum course," said Ven, in the bland tone of one comfortably resigned to sins he could no longer overcome. "You, who used to be so nice." "Well, that's an argument I rather like, because what a man has once been, he may be again." Thomasin blushed. "Except that it's rather harder now," Ven continued. "Why?" she asked. "Because you be richer than you were at that time." "Oh no, not much. I've made it nearly all over to the baby, as it was my duty to do, except just enough to live on." "I'm rather glad of that," said Ven softly, and regarding her from the corner of his eye, "for it makes it easier for us to be friendly." Thomasin blushed again, and when a few more words had been said of a not unpleasing kind, Ven mounted his horse and rode on. This conversation had passed in a hollow of the heath near the old Roman road, a place much frequented by Thomasin, and it might have been observed that she did not in future walk that way less often from having met Ven there now. Whether or not Ven abstained from riding thither because he had met Thomasin in the same place might easily have been guessed from her proceedings about 2 months later in the same year. End of chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Book 6, After Courses. 3. The Serious Discourse of Clym with his Cousin. Throughout this period, Yeobright had more or less pondered on his duty to his cousin Thomasin. He could not help feeling that it would be a pitiful waste of sweet material if the tender-natured thing should be doomed from this early stage of her life onwards to dribble away her winsome qualities on lonely gorse and fern. But he felt this as an economist merely, and not as a lover. His passion for Eustacia had been a sort of conserve of his whole life, and he had nothing more of that supreme quality left to bestow. So far the obvious thing was not to entertain any idea of marriage with Thomasin, even to oblige her. But this was not all. Years ago there had been in his mother's mind a great fancy about Thomasin and himself. It had not positively amounted to a desire, but it had always been a favourite dream. That they should be man and wife in good time, if the happiness of neither were endangered thereby, was the fancy in question. So that what course save one was there now left for any son who reverenced his mother's memory as Yeobright did? It is an unfortunate fact that any particular whim of parents, which might have been dispersed by half an hour's conversation during their lives, becomes sublimated by their deaths into a fiat the most absolute, with such results to conscientious children as those parents, had they lived, would have been the first to decry. Had only Yeobright's own future been involved, he would have proposed to Thomasin with a ready heart. He had nothing to lose by carrying out a dead mother's hope. But he dreaded to contemplate Thomasin wedded to the mere corpse of a lover that he now felt himself to be. He had but 3 activities alive in him. One was his almost daily walk to the little graveyard wherein his mother lay. Another, his just as frequent visits by night to the more distant enclosure which numbered his Eustacia among its dead. The third was self-preparation for a vocation which alone seemed likely to satisfy his cravings, that of an itinerant preacher of the 11th commandment. It was difficult to believe that Thomasin would be cheered by a husband with such tendencies as these. Yet he resolved to ask her and let her decide for herself. It was even with a pleasant sense of doing his duty that he went downstairs to her one evening for this purpose, when the sun was printing on the valley the same long shadow of the housetop that he had seen lying there times out of number while his mother lived. Thomasin was not in her room, and he found her in the front garden. "I've long been wanting, Thomasin," he began, "to say something about a matter that concerns both our futures." "And you are going to say it now?" she remarked quickly, colouring as she met his gaze. "Do stop a minute, Clym, and let me speak first, for, oddly enough, I have been wanting to say something to you." "Oh, by all means, say on, Tamsy." "I suppose nobody can overhear us?" she went on, casting her eyes around and lowering her voice. "Well, first you will promise me this, that you won't be angry and call me anything harsh if you disagree with what I propose." Yeobright promised, and she continued, "What I want is your advice, for you are my relation, I mean sort of guardian to me, aren't you, Clym?" "Well, yes, I suppose I am a sort of guardian. In fact, I am, of course," he said, altogether perplexed as to her drift. "I'm thinking of marrying," she then observed blandly, "but I shall not marry unless you assure me that you approve of such a step." "Why don't you speak?" "I was taken rather by surprise. But nevertheless I'm very glad to hear such news. I shall approve, of course, dear Tamsy. Who can it be? I'm quite at a loss to guess. Oh, no, I'm not. 'Tis the old doctor. Not that I meant to call him old, for he is not very old after all. Ah, I noticed when he attended you last time." No, she said hastily. "'Tis Mr. Venn." Clym's face suddenly became grave. "There, now, you don't like him, and I wish I hadn't mentioned him," she exclaimed almost petulantly. "And I shouldn't have done it either, only he keeps on bothering me so, till I don't know what to do." Clym looked at the heath. "I like Venn well enough," he answered at last. "He is a very honest, and at the same time astute man. He is clever, too, as is proved by his having got you to favour him. But really, Thomasin, he's not quite gentleman enough for me. That is just what I feel. I'm sorry now that I asked you, and I won't think any more of him. At the same time, I must marry him if I marry anybody, that I will say." "I don't see that," said Clym, carefully concealing every clue to his own interrupted intention, which she plainly had not guessed. "You might marry a professional man, or somebody of that sort, by going into the town to live, and forming acquaintances there." "Oh, I'm not fit for town life, so very rural and silly as I always have been. Do you not yourself notice my countrified ways?" "Well, when I came home from Paris I did, a little. But I don't now." "That's because you've got countrified too. Oh, I couldn't live in a street for the world. Egden's a ridiculous old place, but I have got used to it, and I couldn't be happy anywhere else at all." "Neither could I," said Clym. "Then how could you say that I should marry some town man?" "I'm sure, say what you will, that I must marry Diggory, if I marry at all. He has been kinder to me than anybody else, and has helped me in many ways that I don't know of." Thomasin almost pouted now. "Yes, he has," said Clym in a neutral tone. Well, I wish with all my heart that I could say, marry him. But I cannot forget what my mother thought on that matter, and it goes rather against me not to respect her opinion. There is too much reason why we should do the little we can to respect it now." "Very well, then," sighed Thomasin. "I will say no more." "But you're not bound to obey my wishes. I merely say what I think." "Oh, no, I don't want to be rebellious in that way," she said sadly. "I'd no business to think of him. I ought to have thought of my family. What dreadfully bad impulses there are in me." Her lip trembled, and she turned away to hide a tear. Clym, though vexed at what seemed her unaccountable taste, was in a measure relieved to find that at any rate the marriage question in relation to himself was shelved. Through several succeeding days he saw her at different times from the window of his room, moping disconsolately about the garden. He was half angry with her for choosing Ven. Then he was grieved at having put himself in the way of Ven's happiness, who was, after all, as honest and persevering a young fellow as any on Egdon, since he had turned over a new leaf. In short, Clym did not know what to do. When next they met, she said abruptly, "He's much more respectable now than he was then." "Who?" Oh, yes, Diggory Ven." "Aunt only objected because he was a Reddleman." "Well, Thomasin, perhaps I don't know all the particulars of my mother's wish, so you had better use your own discretion." "You will always feel that I slighted your mother's memory." "No, I will not. I shall think you are convinced that had she seen Diggory in his present position, she would have considered him a fitting husband for you. Now that's my real feeling. Don't consult me any more, but do as you like, Thomasin. I shall be content." It is to be supposed that Thomasin was convinced, for a few days after this, when Clym strayed into a part of the heath that he had not lately visited, Humphrey, who was at work there, said to him, "I'm glad to see that Mrs. Wildeve and Ven have made it up again, seemingly." "Have they?" said Clym abstractedly. "Yes, and he do contrive to stumble upon her whenever she walks out on fine days with the child. But, Mr. Yeobright, I can't help feeling that your cousin ought to have married you. 'Tis a pity to make two chimney corners where there need be only one. You could get her away from him now, 'tis my belief, if you were only to set about it." How can I have the conscience to marry after having driven two women to their deaths? Don't think such a thing, Humphrey. After my experience, I should consider it too much of a burlesque to go to church and take a wife. In the words of Job, I have made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? No, Mr. Clym, don't fancy that about driving two women to their deaths. You shouldn't say it." "Well, we'll leave that out," said Yeobright. "But anyhow, God has set a mark upon me which wouldn't look well in a love-making scene. I have two ideas in my head and no others. I'm going to keep a night school, and I'm going to turn preacher. What have you got to say to that, Humphrey?" "I'll come and hear ye with all my heart." "Thanks, 'tis all I wish." As Clym descended into the valley, Thomasin came down by the other path, and met him at the gate. "What do you think I have to tell you, Clym?" she said, looking archly over her shoulder at him. "I can guess," he replied. She scrutinized his face. "Yes, you guess right. It's going to be, after all. He thinks I may as well make up my mind, and I have got to think so too. It's to be on the 25th of next month, if you don't object." "Do what you think right, dear. I am only too glad. that you see your way clear to happiness again. My sex owes you every amends for the treatment you received in days gone by. End of chapter 3. But the author made a note. The writer may state here that the original conception of the story did not design a marriage between Thomasin and Ven. He was to have retained his isolated and weird character to the last, and to have disappeared mysteriously from the heath, nobody knowing whither, Thomasin remaining a widow. But certain circumstances of serial publication led to a change of intent. Readers can therefore choose between the endings, and those with an austere artistic code can assume the more consistent conclusion to be the true one. End of chapter 3, author's note.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marlo Diane. ForbiddenDragon.blogspot.com. The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Book 6. After Courses. 4. Cheerfulness again asserts itself at Bloom's End, and Clem finds his vocation. Anybody who had passed through Bloom's End about 11 o'clock on the morning fixed for the wedding would have found that, while Yeobright's house was comparatively quiet, sounds denoting great activity came from the dwelling of his nearest neighbour, Timothy Fairway. It was chiefly a noise of feet, briskly crunching hither and thither over the sanded floor within. One man only was visible outside, and he seemed to be later at an appointment than he had intended to be, for he hastened up to the door, lifted the latch, and walked in without ceremony. The scene within was not quite the customary one. Standing about the room was the little knot of men who formed the chief part of the Egdon coterie. There being present Fairway himself, Granfer Cantle, Humphrey, Christian, and 1 or 2 turf-cutters. It was a warm day, and the men were as a matter of course in their shirt-sleeves, except Christian, who had always had a nervous fear of parting with the scrap of his clothing when in anybody's house but his own. Across the stout oak table in the middle of the room was thrown a mass of striped linen, which Granfer Cantle held down on one side and Humphrey on the other, while Fairway rubbed its surface with a yellow lump, his face being damp and creased with the effort of the labor. "Waxing a bed tick, souls?" said the newcomer. "Yes, Sam," said Granfer Cantle, as a man too busy to waste words. "Shall I stretch this corner a tad tighter, Timothy?" Fairway replied, and the waxing went on with unabated vigor. "'Tis going to be a good bed, by the look of it," continued Sam, after an interval of silence. "Who may it be for?" "'Tis a present for the new folks that's going to set up housekeeping," said Christian, who stood helpless and overcome by the majesty of the proceedings. "Ah, to be sure, and a valuable one, I believe. Beds be dear to folks that don't keep geese, bain't they, Mr. Fairway?" said Christian, as to an omniscient being. "Yes," said the furs dealer, standing up, giving his forehead a thorough mopping, and handing the beeswax to Humphrey, who succeeded at the rubbing forthwith. Not that this couple be in want of one, but 'twas well to show them a bit of friendliness at the great racking vargety of their lives. I set up both my daughters in one when they were married, and they have been feathers enough for another in the house the last 12 months. Now then, neighbours, I think we laid on enough wax. Grandfer Cantle, you turn the tick right way outwards, and then I'll begin to shake in the feathers." When the bed was in proper trim, Fairway and Christian brought forward vast paper bags, stuffed to the full, but light as balloons, and began to turn the contents of each into the receptacle just prepared. As bag after bag was emptied, airy tufts of down and feathers floated about the room, in increasing quantity till, through a mishap of Christian's, who shook the contents of one bag outside the tick, the atmosphere of the room became dense with gigantic flakes, which descended upon the workers like a windless snowstorm. "I never saw such a clumsy chap as you, Christian," said Grandfer Cantle severely. "You might have been the son of a man that's never been outside Bloomsend in his life for all the wit you have. Really all the soldiering and smartness in the world in the father seems to count for nothing in forming the nater of the son. As far as that Chief Christian is concerned, I might as well have stayed at home and seed nothing, like all the rest ye here. Though as far as myself is concerned, a dashing spirit is counted for summat, to be sure." "Don't you let me down so, father. I feel no bigger than a ninepin after it. I've made but a bruckle hit, I'm afeard." "Come, come, never pitch yourself in such a low key as that, Christian. You should try more," said Fairway. "Yes, you should try more," echoed the Grandfer with insistence, as if he had been the first to make the suggestion. "In common conscience every man ought to either marry or go for a soldier. 'Tis a scandal to the nation to do neither one nor t'other. I did both, thank God, neither to raise man nor to lay him low. That shows a poor do-nothing spirit indeed." "I never had the nerve to stand fire," faltered Christian. "But as to marrying, I've asked here and there, though without much fruit from it. Yes, there's some house or other that might have a man for a master such as he is that's now ruled by a woman alone. Still, it might have been awkward if I'd found her, for die neighbours, there's been nobody left at home to keep down father's spirits to the decent pitch that becomes an old man." "And you've your work cut out to do that, my son," said Grandfer Cantle smartly. "I wish that the dread of infirmities were not so strong in me. I'd start the very first thing tomorrow to see the world over again. But 71, though nothing at home, is a high figure for a rover. Aye, 71 less Candlemas Day, gad, I'd sooner have it in guineas than years." And the old man sighed. "Don't you be mournful, Grandfer," said Fairway. "Empt some feathers into the bed tick, and keep up your heart. Though rather lean in the stalks, you be a green-leaved old man still. There's time enough left till ye yet fill whole chronicles." "Begad, I'll go to 'em, Timothy, to the married pair," said Grandfer Cantle in an encouraged voice, and starting round briskly. "I'll go to 'em to-night and sing a wedding song, hey? 'Tis like me to do so, you know, and they like to see it as such. My down in Cupid's garden was well liked in fore. Still, I've got others as good and even better. What do you say to my 'She called to her love from the lattice above, oh, come in from the foggy, foggy dew'? 'Twould please 'em well at such a time. Really, now I come to think of it, I haven't turned my tongue in my head to the shape of a real good song since old Midsummer Night, when we had the barley mow with the woman, and 'tis a pity to neglect your strong point when there's a few that have compass for such things." "So 'tis, said Fairway. "Now gae the bed a shakedown. We put in 70 pounds of bear's feathers, and I think that's as many as the tick will fairly hold. A bit and a drape wouldn't amiss now, I reckon, Christian. Mull down the victuals from the corner cupboard it can't reach, man, and I'll draw a drap of summat to wet it with." They sat down to a lunch in the midst of their work, feathers around, above, and below them, the original owners of which occasionally came to the open door and cackled begrudgingly at sight of such a quantity of their old clothes. "Upon my soul, I shall be choked," said Fairway, when, having extracted a feather from his mouth, he found several others floating on the mug as it was handed round. "I've swallowed several, and one had a tolerable quill," said Sam placidly from the corner. "Hullo, what's that? Wheels I hear coming?" Grandfer Cantle exclaimed, jumping up and hastening to the door. "Why, 'tis they back again. I didn't expect 'em yet this half hour, to be sure. How quick marrying can be done when you're a mind for it." "Oh, yes, it can soon be done," said Fairway, as if something should be added to make the statement complete. He arose and followed the Grandfer, and the rest also went to the door. In a moment an open fly was driven past, in which sat Ven and Mrs. Ven, Eobright, and a grand relative of Ven's who had come from Budmouth for the occasion. The fly had been hired at the nearest town, regardless of distance and cost, there being nothing on Edon Heath, in Ven's opinion, dignified enough for such an event, when such a woman as Thomasin was the bride, and the church was too remote to a walking bridal party. As the fly passed the group which had run out from the homestead, they shouted hurrah and waved their hands, feathers and down floating from their hair, their sleeves, and the folds of their garments at every motion, and Grandfer Cantel's seals dancing merrily in the sunlight as he twirled himself about. The driver of the fly turned a supercilious gaze upon them. He even treated the wedding pair themselves with something like condescension, for in what other state than heathen could people, rich or poor, exist who are doomed to abide in such a world's end as Egdon? Thomasin showed no such superiority to the group at the door, fluttering her hand as quickly as a bird's wing towards them, and asking Diggory, with tears in her eyes, if they ought not to alight and speak to these kind neighbours. Ven, however, suggested that, as they were all coming to the house in the evening, this was hardly necessary. After this excitement, the saluting party returned to their occupation, and the stuffing and the sewing were soon afterwards finished, when Fareway harnessed a horse, wrapped up the cumbrous present, and drove off with it in the cart to Ven's house at Stickleford. Eobright, having filled the office at the wedding service which naturally fell to his hands, and afterwards returning to the house with the husband and wife, was indisposed to take part in the feasting and dancing that wound up the evening. Thomasin was disappointed. "I wish I could be there without dashing your spirits," he said, "but I might be too much like the skull at the banquet." "No, no." "Well, dear, apart from that, if you would excuse me, I should be glad. I know it seems unkind, but dear Thomasin, I fear I should not be happy in the company. There, that's the truth of it. I shall always be coming to see you at your new home, you know, so that my absence now will not matter." "Then I give in. Do whatever will be most comfortable to yourself." Clem retired to his lodging at the housetop much relieved, and occupied himself during the afternoon in noting down the heads of a sermon, with which he intended to initiate all that really seemed practicable of the scheme that had originally brought him hither, and that he had so long kept in view under various modifications, and through evil and good report. He had tested and weighed his convictions again and again, and saw no reason to alter them, though he had considerably lessened his plan. His eyesight, by long humoring in his native air, had grown stronger, but not sufficiently strong to warrant his attempting his extensive educational project. Yet he did not repine. There was still more than enough of an unambitious sort to tax all his energies and occupy all his hours. Evening drew on, and sounds of life and movement in the lower part of the domicile became more pronounced, the gate and the palings clicking incessantly. The party was to be an early one, and all the guests were assembled long before it was dark. Eobright went down the back staircase and into the heath by another path than that in front, intending to walk in the open air till the party was over, when he would return to wish Thomasin and her husband good-bye as they departed. His steps were insensibly bent toward Mistover by the path that he had followed on that terrible morning, when he learnt the strange news from Susan's boy. He did not turn aside to the cottage, but pushed on to an eminence, whence he could see over the whole quarter that had once been Eustatia's home. While he stood observing the darkening scene, somebody came up. Clem, seeing him but dimly, would have let him pass silently, had not the pedestrian, who was Charlie, recognized the young man, and spoken to him. "Charlie, I have not seen you for a length of time," said Eobright. "Do you often walk this way?" "No," the lad replied. "I don't often come outside the bank." You were not at the Maypole." "No," said Charlie in the same listless tone. "I don't care for that sort of thing now." "You rather liked Miss Eustacia, didn't you?" Eobright gently asked. Eustacia had frequently told him of Charlie's romantic attachment. "Yes, very much." I wish—" "Yes?" "I wish, Mr. Yebright, you could give me something to keep that once belonged to her, if you don't mind." "I shall be very happy to. It will give me great pleasure, Charlie. Let me think what I have of hers that you would like. But come with me to the house, and I'll see." They walked towards Bloom's End together. When they reached, the front was dark, and the shutters were closed, so that nothing of the interior could be seen. "Come round this way," said Clem. "My entrance is at the back for the present." The two went round and ascended the crooked stair in darkness, till Clem's sitting room on the upper floor was reached, where he lit a candle, Charlie entering gently behind. Eobright searched his desk, and taking out a sheet of tissue paper, unfolded from it 2 or 3 undulating locks of raven hair, which fell over the paper like black streams. From these he selected one, wrapped it up, and gave it to the lad, whose eyes had filled with tears. He kissed the packet, put it in his pocket, and said in a voice of emotion, "Oh, Mr. Clem, how good you are to me!" "I will go a little way with you," said Clem, and amid the noise of merriment from below, they descended. Their path to the front led them close to a little side window, whence the rays of candles streamed across the shrubs. The window, being screened from general observation by the bushes, had been left unblinded, so that a person in this private nook could see all that was going on within the room, which contained the wedding guests, except in so far as vision was hindered by the green antiquity of the panes. "Charlie, what are they doing?" said Clem. "My sight is weaker again tonight, and the glass of this window is not good." Charlie wiped his own eyes, which were rather blurred with moisture, and stepped closer to the casement. "Mr. Venn is asking Christian Cantwell to sing," he replied, "and Christian is moving about in his chair as if he were much frightened at the question, and his father has struck up a stave instead of him." "Yes, I can hear the old man's voice," said Clem. "So there's to be no dancing, I suppose. And is Thomasin in the room? I see something moving in front of the candles that resembles her shape, I think." "Yes, she do seem happy. She is red in the face and laughing at something Fairway has said to her. Oh my! What noise was that?" said Clem. "Mr. Venn is so tall that he knocked his head against the beam in guying a skip as he passed under. Mrs. Venn has run up quite frightened, and now she's put her hand to his head to feel if there's a lump. And now they be all laughing again, as if nothing had happened." "Do any of them seem to care about my not being there?" Clem asked. "No, not a bit in the world. Now they are all holding up their glasses and drinking somebody's health." "I wonder if it is mine." "No, 'tis Mr. and Mrs. Venn's, because he is making a hearty sort of speech. There, now Mrs. Venn has got up and is going away to put on her things, I think." "Well, they haven't concerned themselves about me, and it is quite right they should not. It is all as it should be, and Thomasin at least is happy. We shall not stay any longer now, as they will soon be coming out to go home." He accompanied the lad into the heath on his way home, and returning alone to the house a quarter of an hour later, found Venn and Thomasin ready to start, all the guests having departed in his absence. The wedded pair took their seats in the 4-wheeled dog-cart, which Venn's head milker and handyman had driven from Stickleford to fetch them in. Little Eustacia and the nurse were packed securely upon the open flap behind, and the milker, on an ancient overstepping pony, whose shoes clashed like cymbals at every tread, rode in the rear, in the manner of a body servant of the last century. "Now we leave you in absolute possession of your own house again," said Thomasin as she bent down to wish her cousin good night. "It'll be rather lonely for you, Clem, after the hubbub we have been making." "Oh, that's no inconvenience," said Clem, smiling rather sadly, and then the party drove off and vanished in the nightshades, and Yeobright entered the house. The ticking of the clock was the only sound that greeted him, for not a soul remained. Christian, who acted as cook, valet, and gardener to Clem, sleeping at his father's house. Yeobright sat down in one of the vacant chairs, and remained in thought a long time. His mother's old chair was opposite. It had been sat in that evening by those who had scarcely remembered that it ever was hers. But to Clem she was almost a presence there, now as always. Whatever she was in other people's memories, in his she was the sublime saint whose radiance even his tenderness for Eustacia could not obscure. But his heart was heavy. That mother had not crowned him in the day of his espousals, in the day of the gladness of his heart, and events had borne out the accuracy of her judgment, and proved the devotedness of her care. He should not have heeded her for Eustacia's sake even more than for his own. "It was all my fault," he whispered. "Oh, my mother, my mother! Would to God that I could live my life again, and endure for you what you endured for me." On the Sunday after this wedding, an unusual sight was to be seen on Rainbarrow. From a distance there simply appeared to be a motionless figure, standing on the top of the tumulus, just as Eustacia had stood on that lonely summit some 2 years and a half before. But now it was fine warm weather, with only a summer breeze blowing, an early afternoon instead of dull twilight. Those who ascended to the immediate neighborhood of the barrow perceived that the erect form in the center, piercing the sky, was not really alone. Round him upon the slopes of the barrow a number of heath men and women were reclining or sitting at their ease. They listened to the words of the man in their midst, who was preaching, while they abstractedly pulled heather, stripped ferns, or tossed pebbles down the slope. This was the first of a series of moral lectures, or sermons on the mount, which were to be delivered from the same place every Sunday afternoon, as long as the fine weather lasted. The commanding elevation of Rainbarrow had been chosen for 2 reasons. First, that it occupied a central position among the remote cottages around. Secondly, that the preacher thereon could be seen from all adjacent points as soon as he arrived at his post, the view of him being thus a convenient signal to those stragglers who wished to draw nearer. The speaker was bareheaded, and the breeze at each waft gently lifted and lowered his hair. Somewhat too thin for a man of his years, these still numbering less than 33. He wore a shade over his eyes, and his face was pensive and lined. But though these bodily figures were marked with decay, there was no defect in the tones of his voice, which were rich, musical, and stirring. He stated that his discourses to people were to be sometimes secular, and sometimes religious, but never dogmatic, and that his texts would be taken from all kinds of books. This afternoon the words were as follows: "And the king rose up to meet her, and bowed himself unto her, and sat down on his throne, and caused a seat to be set for the king's mother, and she sat at his right hand. Then she said, I desire one small petition of thee, I pray thee say me not nay. And the king said unto her, Ask on, my mother, for I will not say thee nay." Yeobright had, in fact, found his vocation in the career of an itinerant open-air preacher and lecturer on morally unimpeachable subjects, and from this day he labored incessantly in that office, speaking not only in simple language on Rainbarrow and in the hamlets round, but in a more cultivated strain elsewhere, from the steps and porticos of town halls, from market crosses, from conduits, or esplanades and wharves, from the parapets of bridges and barns and outhouses, and all other such places in the neighbouring Wessex towns and villages. He had left alone creeds and systems of philosophy, finding enough and more than enough to occupy his tongue in the opinions and actions common to all good men. Some believed him, and some believed not. Some said that his words were commonplace. Others complained of his want of theological doctrine, while others again remarked that it was well enough for a man to take to preaching who could not see to do anything else. But everywhere he was kindly received, for the story of his life had become generally known. End of Book 6. End of The Return of the Native. Recorded by Marlo Diane. April 6, 2006. Pisgah West, Prince Edward Island.